On this day, the 19th of October, in 2013, the violin that played as the Titanic went down, goodness me, was sold for £900,000 at an auction in Wiltshire. It was played by bandleader Wallace Hartley. This is how the James Cameron film Titanic imagined the scene as it was played through the chaos. Now, Wallace Hartley's body was recovered almost 2 weeks after the sinking. He was reported to be found fully dressed with his violin case strapped to his body.
On this day in 1946, the author Philip Pullman was born. He's famous for the trilogy His Dark Materials. The first book was Northern Lights, adapted recently by the BBC. In this bit, the main character is Lyra. I think her life gets more complicated.
I think Mrs. Coulter will do her best by you, but I can't be sure. So I'm going to give you something. And I need you to promise that you will keep it private.
This matters, Lyra. We need your word.
What is it?
It's an alethiometer. One of only 6 that were ever made.
It's beautiful.
Oh. On this day in 1999, Cher released Stig's favourite song.
Do you believe in life after love? I can feel something inside me say, I really don't think you're strong enough, no.
What's wrong? You don't like the voice changing?
It's rubbish.
It's a dance floor anthem.
Yeah.
Oh, that ended very
Well
abruptly. Believe earned Cher a Guinness World Record for being the oldest female solo artist at 52.
Passed it.
Oh, okay. All right, moustache. To top the Billboard Hot 100. Believe featured the use of auto-tune to distort the pop singer's vocals, which would be widely imitated and known as the Cher effect.
And on this day in 1813, Napoleon was defeated at the Battle of Leipzig in Saxony. Joining us now is a man who knows more Napoleon even than Napoleon did. It's Andrew Roberts, British historian and the journalist who wrote the book Napoleon, A Life. Good morning to Andrew.
Hi there.
So where are we in 1813 when it comes to Napoleon's bid to take over the world? What position was the Napoleonic Empire in at this point?
A very bad one, of course. In 1812, the previous year, he had lost 90% of his 500,000 strong army in Russia in the retreat from Moscow. So the Battle of Leipzig was a key moment, trying to establish essentially whether or not France could still hold territory east of the Rhine.
And presumably by this point, the French people were counting the bodies as they came back.
They were, yes. They'd lost huge numbers, but he still had a very viable army, and it wasn't just the French. He also had Italians and Poles and Saxons and Württembergers in his army. So it was a still tremendously powerful army that, although it had been beaten in Russia, had not been beaten in Europe. And
what's the psychology of them? I mean, we're quite used to talking about the psychology of leaders who don't know when they're beaten. But was Napoleon, was he so bloody minded that he just thought he could keep fighting on, or was he gripped by doubts by this point? I mean, what was the psychology of the man at this stage of his career?
Well, all the way through his career, he had a tremendous sense of his own destiny, his own star, his belief in himself. And that wasn't really affected. He'd had many more wars declared against him than he'd declared on other people. But nonetheless, by now, the storm clouds were very much gathering. He was having domestic opposition back in France. Conscription was going very badly. And the writing, frankly, was on the wall. But as I say, he hadn't, until Leipzig, been comprehensively defeated in Europe.
And what happens next? Because I think people in their minds will be thinking sort of 2 years ahead to Waterloo, when he finally is defeated once and for all. What happens after Leipzig?
Well, after Leipzig, they do lose all the territory east of the Rhine. The Confederation of the Rhine, which he set up to take over from the Holy Roman Empire, was dissolved. And then the following year, in 1814, France itself is invaded.
And then, at that point, he capitulates, doesn't he? At some point in that,
he's forced to abdicate in the April of that year, and then he goes off to Elba, and then in the March of 1815, he comes back from Elba, and of course fights the 100-day campaign, which ends up with Waterloo. But Leipzig is vital; it's an absolutely central thing. If he hadn't lost Leipzig, he could have possibly saved his crown. It was the biggest battle in Europe before the First World War. 560,000 people fought there, 2,200 guns. It was a massive, massive battle.
And maybe perhaps should be a bit more famous, maybe for that reason.